Elena Morin and Caleb Rourke looked like the perfect couple, until one stormy night turned their love story into one of the most chilling and heartbreaking murder cases the town of Ravenshill would ever witness. Ravenshill was the kind of town that looked like it had been painted out of a dream. Neatly trimmed hedges, old cobblestone streets, and rows of pastel houses stood quietly under the soft morning sun. The sound of birds mixed with the distant hum of lawnmowers, and nothing ever truly went wrong there. People left their doors unlocked, children played freely in the park, and gossip rarely went beyond who baked the best apple pie at the weekend fair. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful, and that peace made what happened to Elena Morin feel all the more impossible. Elena had lived in Ravenshill her whole life. She taught art at the local high school, a job she loved more than anything. Her students adored her for her patience and creativity. Every wall in her classroom was covered in color, abstract paintings, sketches, and bright murals that she helped her students make each semester. She lived alone in a small white house at the corner of Willow Lane, but she wasn't lonely. She had a fiancé, Caleb Rourke, who worked as a building contractor in the next town over. Together, they had spent the last 2 years planning their future. A small wedding, a honeymoon in Italy, and maybe one day a home filled with laughter and little feet. To everyone who knew them, they were the perfect couple. As winter faded into spring, Elena's life seemed to bloom right alongside the trees. She was preparing for her art exhibition, her first solo show, and the entire town was proud. Her upcoming wedding was only months away. On the outside, everything looked flawless. But what no one knew was that Elena had been feeling uneasy lately. She'd been locking her doors earlier, keeping her curtains drawn at night, and walking faster whenever she came home after dark. When asked, she brushed it off, saying she was just tired from all the wedding stress. But there was something else in her eyes, something between fear and confusion, that only her closest friends noticed. The last day anyone saw her alive was a Friday evening. She had stayed late at the school, cleaning her brushes and packing supplies. One of the janitors recalled seeing her leave just after 7, humming softly as she carried a box of paints to her car. She waved goodbye and drove off toward her house. It was a clear, chilly night, and her streetlight flickered as she parked. Nothing seemed out of place. The next morning, when she didn't show up to teach her weekend art class, her friend Mara tried calling her. No answer. Hours passed, and messages went unread. By evening, Mara drove to Elena's house. The curtains were still closed, and her car sat in the driveway. The front door was locked, but the faint glow of light spilled from the kitchen window. That uneasy silence that once made Ravenshill peaceful now felt suffocating. When the police finally arrived and broke down the door, they found the home in perfect order. Too perfect. Her phone lay on the counter beside a half-finished cup of tea. Her shoes were neatly by the door, and a soft melody still played from a small speaker in the living room. Upstairs, in her art studio, the officers found her. The woman who had filled the town with color now lay surrounded by her own paintings. Lifeless. Ravenshill had lost its innocence that night. The small town that once believed evil only existed somewhere far away realized it had been living quietly among them all along. The air inside Elena's house was heavy, filled with the faint scent of paint and lavender soap. The officers moved carefully through each room, their footsteps echoing softly against the wooden floors. Nothing appeared to be disturbed. No sign of forced entry, no overturned furniture, no shattered glass. The calmness of the scene was unnerving, like stepping into a photograph frozen at the exact moment before something terrible had happened. On the kitchen counter, a cup of tea sat half-drunk, still faintly warm, suggesting that whatever had occurred had not been long before she died. Upstairs, the sunlight filtered through a crack in the curtains, illuminating the soft colors of her paintings scattered across the floor. There she was, Elena Morin, the artist everyone loved. lying lifeless beneath one of her unfinished canvases. The image was haunting. Her hair was spread across the floor like strands of gold against the white paint-stained tiles. The officers noticed that her hands were slightly tinted with blue paint, as if she had been working just before she died. But what stood out the most was that her body had been covered with her own artwork. Someone had arranged them carefully, almost deliberately, as though trying to send a message. Each painting was different, yet they all seemed to share a single theme: loneliness, silence, and fear. The most recent one, a portrait of a faceless man standing under a street lamp, was missing. It had hung on the wall above her easel just a few days earlier, but now that space was empty. Detectives began to piece together the timeline. Elena had returned home around 7:30 p.m., her car still parked neatly in the driveway. There were no signs of struggle at the door or any window, suggesting she had let her killer inside willingly. The neighbors reported hearing nothing unusual. No screams, no arguments, not even footsteps. One woman remembered seeing a faint light flickering in Elena's studio window close to midnight. But she assumed Elena was simply painting late. As she often did, the medical examiner's early report suggested that Elena had died between 10 p.m. and midnight. There were bruises on her neck and a small cut on her wrist, but nothing else significant. It wasn't just the violence that disturbed investigators, it was the deliberate stillness, the care with which the scene had been arranged afterward. It didn't look like a robbery. Nothing valuable had been taken. Her jewelry was untouched, her wallet lay in plain sight, and her engagement ring remained on her finger. Whoever did this wasn't after money. As word of her death spread through Ravenshill, disbelief turned to grief. People gathered outside her house, leaving flowers and candles on the sidewalk. The local news ran headlines calling it the art teacher tragedy. Her students cried outside the school gates, holding small drawings they had made in her memory. Yet beneath the sadness, whispers began to grow. People started wondering who could have done something so cruel and why. The police turned to those closest to her. They questioned her colleagues, her friends, and finally, her fiancé, Caleb Rourke. He arrived at the police station pale and trembling, insisting he had nothing to do with it. He said he loved her, that he couldn't imagine life without her, but his hands shook when he spoke, and the detectives couldn't ignore the unease in his eyes. The mystery deepened when one of the officers, flipping through Elena's art journal, found something written in her handwriting only 2 days before her death. It was a single unfinished line. "I can't sleep anymore. The shadows under the streetlight are getting closer." For the first time, the investigators began to wonder if Elena's painting of the faceless man hadn't just been art. Maybe it was a warning. Maybe it was something she had seen, something, or someone, who had come for her. Caleb Rourke had always seemed like the perfect fiancé, the kind of man who remembered birthdays, sent flowers for no reason, and talked about a future filled with love and stability. When news of Elena's death spread, he became the image of heartbreak. His face pale, his eyes hollow, his voice trembling as he spoke to reporters. He stood beside Elena's parents during the candlelight vigil, holding her photo close to his chest, as if clinging to the last piece of her he could still touch. But beneath that grief, detectives sensed something else, an uneasiness, a quiet tension that didn't fit with the rest of the story. Detectives began to look deeper into Caleb's life, and what they found didn't match the image he had built. He was drowning in debt. Credit card bills, unpaid loans, and letters from collectors filled his apartment drawers. Most of it stemmed from a failed investment he had made 2 years earlier, a construction project that had fallen apart before it began. To make matters worse, he had borrowed money from a man named Miles Duran, a known private lender with a reputation for being dangerous. Caleb owed him nearly $50,000, and the payments were long overdue. At first, it didn't seem connected, but then investigators learned that just a week before Elena's death, She had discovered something that changed everything. Among her things was a folder filled with legal papers, loan documents bearing her signature. But the handwriting analysis confirmed what detectives suspected. Elena hadn't signed them. Caleb had forged her name to use her savings as collateral for his loan. When confronted with the discovery, Caleb admitted they'd had an argument, but he insisted it was small, nothing more than a misunderstanding. He claimed Elena forgave him, though there was no proof of that conversation. The investigators began to piece together a new theory. Elena, realizing what Caleb had done, may have threatened to expose him. The embarrassment and financial ruin could have destroyed his reputation, especially with their wedding just months away. But even that didn't explain the strange artistic staging of the crime scene or the missing painting. It was as if someone wanted her death to have meaning beyond a simple act of rage. When detectives checked Caleb's alibi, he claimed he had been visiting his brother in another town on the night of the murder. For a moment it seemed solid, until a neighbor came forward with new information. Around midnight, she had seen a figure walking down Willow Lane. The person was tall, wearing a hooded coat, and carrying something in their hands. Her security camera caught a blurry image, just enough to show the shape of the figure. The height and build were consistent with Caleb. Confronted with this, Caleb hesitated but stuck to his story. He said he didn't go near Elena's house that night and that the figure could have been anyone, but his nervousness only deepened suspicion. He began avoiding calls from investigators, missing appointments, and changing his story in small but noticeable ways. Then came another discovery. One of Elena's neighbors remembered seeing a dark sedan parked 2 blocks away that same night, its engine idling for nearly an hour. The plate number traced back to a rental company, and the vehicle had been rented under Caleb's name. The facade of grief began to crack. The calm, mourning fiancé now looked more like a man trapped in a web of his own lies. But the detectives couldn't close the case yet. Something about the crime scene still felt too calculated, too deliberate. Someone else might have been involved, someone who knew both Caleb and Elena, and who had something far darker to hide. 2 weeks after the funeral, the investigation had begun to stall. Detectives were convinced Caleb knew more than he was saying. But without hard evidence, the case risked falling apart. Then an unexpected call came that changed everything. An art collector from the nearby city of Linford claimed someone had approached him online, offering to sell a painting that looked strikingly similar to one of Elena Morin's works. The collector sent a photograph of it to the police. There was no mistaking it. It was Elena's missing piece, the haunting image of the faceless man beneath a street lamp. The painting had vanished from her house the night she was killed, and now it had resurfaced under suspicious circumstances. The seller had used a fake name, but the messages contained a clue. The username was MR, the same initials as Miles Duran, Caleb's lender. Investigators dug deeper and found that the IP address used in the online exchange was linked to an apartment Miles rented on the outskirts of Linford. Within hours, a warrant was issued. When officers entered his apartment, they found Elena's painting leaning against the wall, wrapped in brown paper. Around it were several of her personal belongings: a silk scarf, her sketchbook, and a small envelope addressed to Caleb in her handwriting. The discovery sent chills through the room. It was no longer just a matter of financial dispute or jealousy. It was beginning to look like something larger and more organized. The letter to Caleb was unfinished. The ink smudged as if written in panic. It read, "I know what you and Miles are planning, and I can't let it happen." The last word trailed off abruptly, leaving only a faint line across the paper, as though she had been interrupted mid-sentence. When Miles was brought in for questioning, he didn't seem surprised. He was calm, even arrogant, sitting back in the chair with a cold smirk. He admitted knowing Caleb and confirmed the debt, but denied having anything to do with the murder. He claimed Caleb had offered him money to teach Elena a lesson, but insisted he never intended for her to die. According to him, things had gone wrong, and Caleb had panicked. It was a story that shifted the blame without giving full answers. Yet some of his statements aligned too closely with evidence to ignore. Detectives began tracing Miles's financial records and found recent cash deposits made by Caleb, totaling nearly $10,000, just days before Elena's death. It was enough to suggest a deal had been made between them. Still, the way Elena had been killed, the care taken to cover her with her paintings, the removal of one specific piece, didn't fit the pattern of a quick job or accidental death. It looked deliberate, symbolic, almost personal. When investigators pressed Miles further, cracks began to form in his story. He finally admitted to entering the house that night, saying Caleb had asked him to retrieve something valuable. He claimed he found Elena awake, painting, and when she realized who he was, she tried to call for help. A struggle followed, and she fell. But the coroner's report contradicted every word. Elena had been strangled with precise force, not killed by accident. Still, the most haunting question remained unanswered. Why take the painting? It was not valuable enough to sell for much, and yet it seemed to mean everything to the people involved. One officer noticed a small symbol on the back of the canvas, an emblem that matched several other stolen artworks recovered from galleries across the region. It appeared that Elena's murder was connected not just to jealousy or money, but to something far deeper, something rooted in the dark world of stolen art. For the first time, detectives began to see that Caleb and Miles weren't acting alone. Someone else had been pulling the strings, hiding behind the colors and brush strokes that once defined Elena's peaceful life. The confession from Miles cracked the investigation wide open. His calmness faded once detectives confronted him with the forensic evidence. The fibers on Elena's carpet matching those from his jacket, the faint traces of his shoe prints near the stairs, and the fingerprints smudged faintly on her studio door. Faced with the possibility of a life sentence, Miles finally began to talk. What he revealed turned the case from a simple crime of passion into something darker and more intricate. He claimed Caleb had begged him for help weeks before the murder. Caleb was terrified that Elena would expose his forged loan documents and destroy him financially. Miles said he never planned to kill her. He was only supposed to frighten her enough to keep her quiet. But according to him, when he arrived at the house that night, things got out of control. Miles told detectives he had entered the house through the back door, which had been left unlocked. He found Elena in her studio painting. She recognized him instantly. She had seen him once before when he came to collect payment from Caleb. Realizing why he was there, she panicked and tried to reach for her phone. Miles said he grabbed her arm, trying to stop her, and in the struggle, she fell against the table. He claimed that she stopped breathing after that it was all a tragic accident. But the coroner's report once again proved otherwise. The marks on her neck were deep and deliberate. She had been strangled, and the pressure had been applied for several seconds, long enough to ensure she couldn't survive. Caleb's involvement was impossible to deny any longer. Forensic teams found traces of blue paint in his car, the same pigment from Elena's missing painting. It was clear that after her death, he had returned to the scene to remove the artwork. Perhaps he thought it contained something incriminating, something that connected him to her final hours. The police believed he had staged part of the crime scene himself, covering her with her paintings to make it appear symbolic, maybe even to mislead investigators. Still, one part of the story didn't add up. In the final minutes of her life, Elena had recorded a short voice memo on her phone, possibly as evidence. The recording was faint, but clear enough to make out her trembling whisper. "It's not just Caleb. Someone else is here." The words sent a shiver through everyone who heard them. If both Caleb and Miles were already accounted for, who was the someone else? Detectives began to revisit every person in Elena's circle, her students, her colleagues, and her mentors. They discovered that Elena had been working on a new collection of paintings before her death, one that involved restoring old, damaged pieces she had purchased from a former gallery curator named Lucinda Vale. Lucinda was known in the art community for her precision and skill, but there were rumors she had been involved in black market dealings years ago. Elena had mentioned to her friend Mara that she'd found strange markings beneath the layers of paint in one of the restored canvases, like hidden signatures or codes. When police searched Lucinda's records, they found something chilling. She and Miles had worked together years earlier, moving stolen art through private collectors under the guise of restoration. Elena's discovery had threatened to expose everything. The faceless man painting wasn't just an eerie image. It was her way of documenting what she had uncovered. The faceless figure represented the people behind the crimes, those who profited from art thefts that stretched far beyond Ravenshill. Miles had been sent to silence her, but he wasn't the only one responsible. Caleb's greed had opened the door, but Lucinda's fear of exposure had sealed Elena's fate. She was the silent presence in the shadows that night, the someone else Elena had sensed before she died. When the truth finally surfaced, the beautiful world of color Elena had created crumbled into something dark, where every brushstroke carried a secret, and every painting told a story of betrayal. When the investigation turned toward Lucinda Vale, everything that had once seemed confusing began to align with eerie precision. Lucinda had been Elena's mentor years before, guiding her through art school and helping her secure her first teaching position. She was elegant, quiet, and deeply respected in the local art world. To anyone looking from the outside, she was the picture of sophistication, a woman who had dedicated her life to preserving beauty. But beneath that calm exterior was a hidden history of deception and greed. Police records revealed that she had been under investigation nearly a decade earlier for her ties to an underground network that traded in stolen art. The case had collapsed for lack of evidence, and she had simply vanished from public life for several years before resurfacing in Ravenshill. When detectives brought Lucinda in for questioning, she maintained her composure, answering each question with careful calmness. But when they presented her with photographs of Elena's missing painting, the mask began to crack. She denied everything at first, claiming she hadn't spoken to Elena in months. Yet phone records showed several calls between them in the weeks before the murder. One call lasted nearly an hour on the very night Elena died. The truth could no longer be avoided. Lucinda had known exactly what Elena had discovered. The hidden markings inside the restored paintings were proof of a forgery and smuggling operation that had been active for years. Elena, innocent and honest, had unknowingly stumbled upon evidence that could destroy Lucinda's entire network. When pressed further, Lucinda broke down. She admitted that Caleb had confided in her about his debt and the forged documents, and she had seen an opportunity. By manipulating Caleb's fear and desperation, she had convinced him that Elena's discovery would ruin both of them. Lucinda told him that if Elena exposed the fraud, not only would he go to prison, but she would lose everything she had built. She had whispered enough lies to turn his panic into reckless action. Miles was then brought in to finish what Caleb could not. Lucinda had orchestrated the entire plan behind the scenes, ensuring that if anything went wrong, the blame would fall squarely on Caleb and Miles. In the end, all three were caught. Caleb, broken by guilt and fear, confessed everything in exchange for a reduced sentence, though it earned him little sympathy. Miles received a long prison term for his direct involvement in the killing, and Lucinda was sentenced to life without parole. Her courtroom demeanor never changed. No tears, no apologies, only a faint, cold stare as the verdict was read. The town of Ravenshill was never the same after that. The White House on Willow Lane remained empty for years, its windows dark and silent. Elena's parents donated her remaining artworks to the Ravenshill Museum, where her final piece, The Faceless Man Under the Street Lamp, was displayed behind glass. Beneath it, a small plaque carried a simple inscription. She painted light, even when surrounded by darkness. Visitors often stood before it in silence, studying the faceless figure, and the brush strokes that seemed to shimmer faintly under the light, as if her spirit still lingered within the paint. Every March, on the anniversary of her death, people left white lilies outside the museum doors. Students who once learned from her spoke about how her kindness had changed their lives. The tragedy of Elena Morin became a reminder that even in the quietest towns, darkness can hide behind beauty, and that sometimes the people who seem to protect art are the ones willing to destroy it for greed. Her story lived on not just as a tale of loss, but as a warning that truth and innocence, no matter how fragile, can expose even the most carefully hidden evil.